Welcome to So Fabulous Fabrics. This video has been made in conjunction with Hazel A Patterns. Today I'm going to show you how to stitch a foundation paper pieced heart, which is featured on the front of Hazel's pattern, the Big Heart Boxy Pouch. To make this foundation paper pieced heart, you will need some fabric scissors, some paper scissors, a quilting ruler, 2 different pieces of patterned or plain fabric. You'll need an iron and either a pressing mat or an ironing board, some sewing pins, the pattern for the heart, a rotary cutter for fabric, and a rotary cutter that has got an old blade in it which could be used for cutting through paper and fabric together, or if you've only got one rotary cutter then just swap the blade over when you need to come to do that part. And a piece of either template plastic, which is very thin, or a piece of cardboard, which also needs to be very thin. This is for when you want to press back your paper when you're doing your foundation paper piecing. So that's all the things that you need. So let's get started. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to cut the pattern out using my paper scissors. And what we're going to do is we're going to leave quite a margin around the printed box, and I'll explain why that's going to be in a moment. So we'll just move those out of the way. Here are the 2 halves of the template cut out with the extra border around where the lines are. So what I'm going to do first of all is, because I'm using the heart fabric, I want the heart to actually sit in the middle of this piece, so when it's put together you will have whole hearts running down the middle. So to be able to do this, I'm going to fold back where the stitching line is on both pieces. Just fold that over and give it a press on both pieces. And where the hearts are on the fabric, I'm going to place this line in the middle of some hearts. So for instance, these 2 hearts here, I'm going to pop the pattern piece in the middle, so where the 2 pieces join just there is where this folded line is going to sit. So you can just see that this heart here is within this shaded area, and the top of this heart is within the shaded area at the bottom. So I'm just going to pin that in place. Just pop a couple of pins in, and then using the other half of this template, I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but I'm going to use a different heart that's on the fabric, but still placing it exactly the same way. And if you want to measure how high your point is here from the point of your heart, then that's a good idea. I'm just going to eyeball it. So that's, just move that down a little bit in the middle of those 2 hearts. So again, I'm just going to pop a pin in, top and bottom. And then Once you've done that, you want to unfold the piece that you've actually folded underneath, and then you're going to cut out all the way around the actual paper that you previously cut. So we'll do that, and then we'll have a look and see if we've got them in the right position. The reason I have cut the fabric the same size as the piece of paper that we're using is so as I can make sure that this heart is covered in the middle, and because I want to match the hearts in the centre, it just makes this a little bit easier to cut it the same size as the template. If you're using plain fabric, then obviously you don't need to do that. You can just cut a piece which will totally cover this part of the pattern, B1 and A1. Okay, so those are my two pieces cut, and now what we're going to do is we'll just fold in this piece here on this solid line, so that will be the seam line when the two halves are stitched together. So I folded that flat. I'm just going to fold the fabric over the top. This is the excess fabric and the seam allowance. Just going to fold that over the top. Just going to pop a couple of pins in. Now the reason I'm doing this is once I've done it on both pieces, I'm going to put them together to see if I have got the hearts in the right place running down the centre of the FPP heart. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that I have got them in the right place. So that's one, and then we'll do the other one. So as I say, just fold that on your solid stitching line that runs down the centre of your paper FPP heart, and fold the fabric over, pop some pins in, and then we'll pop the two pieces together. So I'll just flip that over. So it's not going to lay very flat, unfortunately, but you can see in the middle where the two hearts are joining together. So once they are stitched, I will have hearts in the centre of the piece. Okay, we're ready now to move on to the next step. For this next step, I have a piece of template plastic, a quilting ruler, and two rotary cutters, one for cutting the fabric and one for cutting through the paper. Now I've got an old blade in this one, which I'm not going to be using for fabric any longer, but it is very useful for when I actually want to cut through the paper and the fabric. So that's why I've got a second rotary cutter. So what we're going to do is we've covered the fabric on A1, which is your piece underneath, and we're now going to do this tiny little piece A2, this tiny little triangle at the top corner. So we won't need very much fabric for it, but we do want to make sure that we have got enough. So I'm going to cut a piece from my fairy fabric that is probably going to be approximately, I don't know, 1.5 inch square. So that's my piece of fabric. If you want to fussy cut your fabric, you can do. I'm not going to do it for the outside because some of these pieces are very tiny, and I just think it'd just be nice to have a bit of colour on there. So that's my piece. So the next thing you're going to do is using your template plastic, yes that is correct, Pop it on the line, on the solid line that joins A1 to A2, and fold your paper back and just smooth it down. You can then take your template, oh dear, I'm having trouble with that word, template plastic out, and we're now going to cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So resting your ruler on the edge of the folded back paper, we will then just trim the excess fabric off. Right, so we are now ready to join this piece of fabric to this piece, making sure that the small triangle A2 is going to be covered by this piece of fabric, and you're putting the pieces of fabric together, right sides together. So I know that I have cut quite a large piece, so I think I'm quite confident in knowing that that will be covered. So we're then going to flip the piece of paper back, and we will stitch along this line that joins A1 to A2. So we stitch straight through the paper. I'm going to leave some stitching either side as well, and then when we come back we will be folding this piece of fabric over and pressing it, and then we can see that we have covered A2. So I'm now going to go to the machine and do that, and then we'll have a look. Always use a short stitch length when you're stitching for FPP. The reason for this is when you've finished and you need to take the paper off, the paper will always come away a lot easier if you use a much shorter stitch length. So I use a stitch length of 1.5 when I am doing my foundation paper piecing. So there you can see, hopefully, where I have stitched along the line that joins A1 to A2 with a 1.5 stitch length, and that's it on the reverse. So I'm just going to trim the threads off, the loose threads, and then I'm going to press it open. And then if you hold it up to the light, you'll be able to see whether you've actually covered that very small piece, which I have done very easily. So we're then going to move on to piece A3. So I'm going to cut another small piece of fabric to be able to cover this, and this is going to be stitched across A1 again and across A2. Now this piece of fabric, you will need to make sure it covers the seam allowance. Because this piece is bordering or touching the stitching line, it will need to cover that seam allowance piece as well. So I'm cutting a piece probably about 2-inch square, and if I just laid that on the top, I can see that with the seam allowance as well, I've got plenty to be able to cover that piece of A3, which is the triangle. So again, we're going to put our piece of template plastic along this line, joining A3 to A1 and A2. And we will fold that back So you've got a crease in your paper. Now where you have stitched over the previous line of A2, you'll just need to pull the paper away a little bit, away from the stitches, just to make sure it is actually flat. So that's got a crease in it. So again, we're now going to cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance using your ruler and your rotary cutter. And then taking your piece of fabric that you've just cut, we're now going to place this against this cut line here, so as it will cover A3 once it is folded open and pressed away from the seam. So just folding the paper back again, I'm going to pop that at the top of the fabric and just have a look and see where the lines finish on that triangle, and make sure that you've got enough fabric either side to cover it. So I'm going to pop over to the sewing machine and just stitch along that piece, and then we'll come and check it. So there is the piece A3 stitched in place, and I've pressed it open. So there you can see the stitching along the line there, and the fabric's just poking up from the top, because as I said previously, you need to make sure any fabrics that actually touch the outside lines of this piece need to extend over the seam allowance, which is this piece here. So I'm now going to move on to number A4, and again I'm going to fold this back here using my template plastic and trim off a 1/4 inch, ready to join A5. So I'm going to carry on adding these pieces, and then when I come to A10 we'll come back and have a look, and we'll add that piece on, and then it will be ready for trimming. I've finished stitching all of my pieces of fabric on, apart from number 10. So we'll just flip it over so you can see how it looks from the right side. So that's how it looks at the moment. So you can see there's the top of the heart shape just there. But once we've trimmed all of these pieces back, then you'll be able to see the pattern properly. So we'll just flip it back again. So I've got my last piece of fabric for piece 10, and I'm now going to fold back this line. This is the last line to fold back that joins all of these pieces together, and then stitch this piece on. So I'll just get my piece of plastic and just pop that on just to where the line is. Fold the paper back, and again, if you've got your stitching in the fabric where you've gone over the stitching line, which is absolutely fine, just pull it away just to release it. So that's that piece folded back, and then I'm going to cut my 1/4 inch seam allowance with my rotary cutter. And we are then ready to place the last piece of fabric. Now I've sort of measured and cut this piece already. So how I did this, I had my fabric flat on the table and I put one edge of the fabric against this line, but putting a rough 1/4 of an inch, which would be the seam allowance over the line, and then making sure that all of the lines, the stitching lines and the cutting line will be covered. I've cut a sort of rectangle piece of fabric out, which I will now sew on to the reverse. So just flipping that over. So this is going to be placed against the fabric already there, and you can either hold it up to the light just to see where your lines are and to make sure that you have got this cutting line covered, then you know that you've covered the whole piece. So that is now ready to stitch. So we'll be stitching along this line, folding back and pressing it. So once it is stitched on, you can now fold it open and flat, and I'm just going to press along this crease here. So there we go. So I'm just going to flip it back over so I can see that if you're looking where this margin is, most of the fabrics have gone over the margin. Some obviously have been aligned up from the beginning, but what we can do now is, using either a pair of scissors, or I'm going to use my rotary cutter that's got an old blade in it, I'm going to cut away all of the edges of the paper. Make sure that you don't cut your paper away on the sewing line. It needs to be the slightly thinner line that's on the outer, and that is going to be your edge of your seam allowance. And there you have the first half of your FPP heart shape made. So I'm now going to finish B, and then we'll come back and join them together. So I have both halves of the FPP heart ready, and I'm now going to take the paper off. I've got my awl here just in case any of these tiny pieces are difficult to get off the fabric. So I'm going to start pulling from the edge just very gently. It should come away quite easily because the stitching is so small, but obviously you don't want to pull any stitches out, so just go gently. And if you've got bits of paper stuck in the stitches, then you could either, well, you really want something with a pointed end, so you could use an awl, or you could use a needle or a pin, something that's got a good point on it to be able to get the paper out. But if you just sort of pull slowly and gently, hopefully it will come away quite easily and not leave any paper behind. I think it's a bit stuck in there, that's fine. We'll pull that piece out when we get round to finishing. but it will come away quite easily. So I'm using paper which has been made for foundation paper piecing. And of course, where you glued the piece on originally, when you very first started, that should come away quite easily as well. But because it's on the reverse of the fabric, if it leaves a faint mark, then it won't matter. And there we go. So because some of the pieces were very small on the back, it was actually easier to use a pin and just hook underneath the paper to get it off. So I'm going to do the other side, and then we will be then stitching them together down the middle. So there are the two halves. So I'm now going to pop them together, and finding the point of the V of the heart on both sides, I'm going to put those together so they're even, and then the bit at the bottom, and then I'm going to sew the two pieces together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to use pins for this, which I don't use very often, but I don't want it to shift, so I'm going to pop some pins in where the crucial bits are that need to meet up. So I will do that, and I will get it sewn with a normal 2.5 stitch length, and then we'll iron it open and see how it looks. Here we have our foundation paper pieced heart, which is going to be stitched into the Big Heart Boxy Pouch. So I hope you've enjoyed that little insight into foundation paper piecing, and have a look out for the pattern to either download through So Fabulous Fabrics Pay Hip shop or my Etsy shop. Thanks for watching.